From the moment she could walk, the girl carried herself with a gentleness that was impossible to ignore. Her voice was soft, her smile effortless, and her presence seemed to calm even the most restless of children and elders alike. In the mornings she would walk down to the river with her clay pot, barefoot on the cool earth, pausing to greet those she passed with kindness that felt as though it carried no expectation of return. The old women in the village often remarked that she seemed blessed by forces unseen, touched by something beyond ordinary fate, and while some admired this gift, others looked upon her with suspicion. For to shine too brightly in a place where envy smoldered was dangerous, and her light was one that could not be dimmed. She lived simply, the daughter of parents who had passed too soon, raised by relatives who tolerated her presence more than they cherished it. Yet she never let their coldness harden her. She fetched water for them without complaint, cooked what little food there was, and tended to the small garden outside their hut with steady care. Children in the village flocked to her whenever they could, chasing her laughter as she showed them games by the riverbank or shared small stories whispered to her by the elders before they drifted into forgetfulness. She became, for the young, a figure of safety and joy, someone whose warmth reminded them of what love was supposed to feel like. But where children saw beauty, many adults saw a problem. Some said she was too loved by the little ones, that she charmed them into following her with unnatural ease. Others whispered that her eyes, though kind, carried a depth that unsettled them, as though she could see more than she was meant to. In the gatherings around the fire, while songs rose and laughter spilled into the night, there were those who leaned close to each other, muttering that she was different in ways that could not be trusted. Difference, in their eyes, was not a gift but a threat. Still, she bore the whispers with grace. When women snapped at her for walking too close, she apologized softly and stepped aside. When men scoffed at her humility, suggesting it was nothing more than a mask for cunning, she lowered her head and said nothing. She learned early that silence was sometimes the only shield against cruelty, though it often left her feeling hollow inside. The ache of rejection followed her into the quiet nights when she lay awake, listening to the distant howls of jackals beyond the village edge, wondering if she belonged anywhere at all. Despite the cruelty, there were moments when her kindness shone so strongly it could not be denied. Once, when an elder collapsed on the path, it was she who knelt beside him, her hand steady as she gave him water and sat by his side until others came. When a child was bitten by a scorpion, she stayed through the night, crushing herbs and whispering comfort, her touch soothing the child's fever until dawn. Yet even in these acts of selflessness, whispers rose. Why does she always appear in times of need? Some muttered. Is it truly goodness, or does she weave misfortune so she can mend it and win hearts? Her guardians, too, were caught between grudging appreciation of her work and simmering resentment of her presence. She ate little, often giving up her share for others, but somehow they always accused her of being a burden. Her beauty, subtle yet undeniable, drew the attention of young men in the village, and this only worsened the envy of the women. They saw in her a reflection of what they feared losing: the admiration of others, the love of their children, the respect of their community. She had not sought any of it, but it clung to her like light clings to the dawn. And so she grew up in the strange space between admiration and resentment, loved by the innocent and doubted by the cynical, caught in a web she had not spun. Her days were filled with simple labors, fetching water, tending fires, grinding grain, yet beneath those humble tasks lived a heart that longed for acceptance, for a place where her kindness was not mistaken for danger. She had no malice in her, only a deep, quiet hope that one day she would be seen for who she truly was, rather than the twisted shapes painted by envy and fear. The villagers could never admit it aloud, but there was something in her presence that made them uneasy because it reminded them of what they lacked. Her gentleness highlighted their bitterness, her patience shamed their tempers, her humility mocked their pride. And so, little by little, they began to see her not as a blessing among them but as a shadow cast across their peace, a mirror of their own failings. She, innocent and unknowing, carried on with her life, unaware of the storm that envy was quietly gathering against her. They had always watched her, though she never noticed. The girl had grown among them as one of their own, yet there was something about her presence that unsettled the hearts of those around her. She was gentle and trusting, the kind of soul who believed every smile offered to her was genuine, every hand extended to her was one of care. But beneath those masks, the villagers whispered. They said she was too different, her kindness too disarming, her beauty too radiant, her spirit too unyielding in its purity. Such traits, instead of inspiring admiration, became fuel for envy. Where her laughter brightened the huts, others found their own gloom magnified. Where her presence soothed conflicts, others saw her influence spreading too far. Jealousy grew, and with it, a poisonous desire to see her light extinguished. It began quietly, in hushed conversations under the shade of the baobab tree, in murmurs exchanged between kin and neighbor. A cousin, envious of the way elders praised her for her wisdom, planted the first seed. She is not like us. Have you noticed? Shadows cling to her. Misfortune will follow. Soon, others echoed the thought, their motives twisted and personal. A neighbor whose crops had failed pointed at her smile as though it mocked his suffering. A girl her age, spurned by a suitor who admired the innocent one, fueled the flames with venom. If she remains, none of us will know peace. She takes what is not hers, our attention, our blessings, our fate. What had once been whispers swelled into a chorus. Some believed it was jealousy, pure and sharp. Others, gripped by superstition, convinced themselves she was cursed, a harbinger of hidden doom. A greedy uncle eyed the small inheritance she had been promised and saw an opportunity in the growing hostility. To him, her innocence was not a shield but a vulnerability he could exploit. Together, their motives intertwined, greed feeding superstition, envy cloaking cruelty. The plot formed under the guise of unity. One night, when the moon was veiled by clouds, they gathered in secret. "We must act," said the uncle, his eyes gleaming with calculation. "If she stays, her shadow will swallow us all. Better we rid ourselves of her now, before the spirits themselves rise in anger." Others nodded, convincing themselves that what they planned was not murder but protection. It was easier to call it survival than admit it was hatred. They waited for the day of the harvest celebration, when joy filled the air and suspicion was least expected. She had danced with them, her laughter ringing pure, her steps light on the earth. She never saw the glances exchanged behind her back, the smiles that carried no warmth. When the drums quieted and the village feasted, they lured her away. A promise of help with firewood, an offer to walk together to the stream, it did not take much to win her trust. She followed, unaware she was being led not to safety but to betrayal. Deep within the forest, they surrounded her. Torches flickered against their faces, casting monstrous shadows that made them look less like kin and more like hunters. Confusion clouded her gaze at first. "Why have you brought me here?" she asked, her voice soft, almost breaking with unease. Silence answered her, a silence broken only by the uncle's harsh words. "You are not one of us. You bring curses, misfortune, and envy. Tonight it ends." Her protests fell on deaf ears. She tried to plead, tried to remind them of the love they once shared, the bonds of kinship, the trust she had given them freely. But to hearts hardened by jealousy and greed, her words were nothing but the whispers of guilt. They pushed her to the ground, striking her when she resisted. Blood stained the earth where she fell, her cries swallowed by the night. Each blow was fueled by resentment, each shove justified by lies they told themselves to silence their own shame. At last, when she could no longer rise, they left her there. Her breaths were shallow, her eyes dim but still alive with disbelief. The forest grew still as if mourning her suffering, the trees bearing silent witness to their cruelty. They turned their backs, convinced she would not survive the night. To them she was already gone, a sacrifice to their fears, a victim to their greed. As they walked away, not one of them looked back. They returned to the village with lies ready on their tongues. "She wandered too far," they would say. "Perhaps the spirits took her." And those who had not lifted a hand would believe because it was easier than facing the truth. The girl's gentle heart had been betrayed not by strangers, but by the very people she trusted most. And though her body lay broken in the darkness, something within her lingered, something they had not killed, something they could not understand. For betrayal cuts deeper than any wound, and its echo does not fade. In the silence of the forest, where her breath waned and her blood fed the soil, her shadow stirred, remembering everything. The forest had grown unbearably silent after they left her. No rustle of leaves, no song of crickets, no gentle whisper of wind to comfort her. She lay where they had thrown her, sprawled upon the damp earth, her breath shallow, each rise and fall of her chest a labor. The pain burned through her ribs, her arms, her legs, but it was not the bruises alone that crushed her, it was the knowledge of what had been done. Betrayal weighed heavier than any wound, and its sting reached deeper than the blood that seeped into the soil. Her hands trembled as she tried to move, to crawl, to push herself up against the roots of the old tree that loomed above her. But her strength failed with every attempt. The forest floor pressed cold against her cheek, reminding her that she was no longer safe, no longer sheltered by the warmth of the village fires. The people she had loved, the ones she had smiled at every morning, had become her executioners. Each face came back to her, her uncle's greedy eyes, her cousin's smirk of envy, the girl whose hatred burned sharp, the villagers who had turned their heads and walked away. She saw them all in flashes as if the shadows of their betrayal hovered above her, mocking her even now. Her body shuddered with weakness. Blood stained her dress, streaked her arms, sticky and heavy against her skin. She could feel the warmth leaving her limbs, as though her very life was seeping into the ground. With each ragged breath, she wondered if this was how death came, slow, cruel, watching her dignity unravel bit by bit. She wanted to scream, but her voice was gone, swallowed by the blows, muted by exhaustion. Only her eyes, wet with tears she could not stop, spoke the truth of her torment. The night seemed endless. The stars above blurred in her vision, their silver light distorted by the veil of tears. She remembered how she used to look up at them as a child, whispering wishes to the sky, believing the universe was kind. Now even their glow felt distant, indifferent to her suffering. Her last thoughts wandered between what she had lost and what she had never been given. She had offered her trust freely, believing love and kinship were unshakable. She had never imagined those bonds could turn to chains, dragging her into betrayal's pit. Her chest ached with every breath, the air refusing to fill her lungs. She thought of the village, the children she used to play with, the elders who once praised her kindness. Did they know? Did they believe the lies her betrayers would weave? Or would they wonder why she never returned, her absence a quiet question no one dared to voice? The thought of being forgotten frightened her more than death itself. To be erased, to vanish without memory, without justice. This was a second death, sharper than the first. Yet in the shadow of despair, her mind clung stubbornly to fragments of light. She remembered laughter, the pure, unguarded sound of her own joy before the world turned cruel. She remembered the feel of morning sun on her skin, the smell of rain-soaked earth, the rhythm of drums during festivals. Her heart ached for those moments, for the simple happiness that had once been hers. And as she thought of them, sorrow twisted into a deeper wound, because she knew they were gone, taken from her by the hands of those she trusted most. Her tears fell, mixing with the soil beneath her. Injustice burned inside her like fire, scorching hotter than the pain of her injuries. Why her? What crime had she committed, except to live with an open heart? Was her kindness a curse? Was her beauty an invitation for hatred? The questions tormented her, circling her mind as her body weakened. Her vision dimmed, and still her thoughts refused to quiet. It was not the idea of death that pained her most, but the cruelty of being cast aside, left to die without care, without dignity, without a single hand to hold her in her last breath. Her body trembled violently, then stilled. The air grew colder and her pulse weakened, like a drumbeat fading in the distance. She knew the end was near. And in that moment, as her heart labored its final rhythms, she vowed silently that this was not the last of her. Even if her body crumbled, even if her breath ceased, her pain would not die. It would linger, echoing through the earth, carried by the shadows of the night. Her eyes closed slowly, lashes wet against her cheeks. A single tear slipped down, not just of sorrow but of defiance. A tear that whispered a truth no one had expected. Though she was abandoned, though she was broken, she would not vanish quietly. Something deep within her, something darker and stronger than flesh, stirred as her life faded. And while her body succumbed to silence, her shadow began to remember, to breathe, to rise. She had been left for dead, but her last thoughts carved a warning into the darkness. Injustice does not sleep, and betrayal never goes unpunished. The night held its breath as her final one slipped away. The forest, so still, seemed to bow in silence as her body lay unmoving, fragile as broken clay. Yet where death claimed flesh, something else began to stir. From the faint glow of the moon above, her shadow lengthened, stretching unnaturally across the ground. It did not vanish with her stillness. Instead, it pulsed as if infused with a life of its own. At first it quivered, faint and uncertain, like smoke rising from dying embers. But with each passing moment, it gathered strength, darkening, sharpening, becoming more than a mere reflection. The shadow uncurled itself from the ground where her body lay. Slowly, carefully, it began to move, its edges trembling as though unsure of its new form. The body it had once clung to was still, cold, lifeless, but the shadow refused to die with her. It rose, its shape stretching into the likeness of the girl. Thin arms, delicate shoulders, a face indistinct yet eerily familiar. It hovered close to her body at first, swaying like a tethered spirit, as though reluctant to let go of the vessel that had given it form. But then, with a whisper of unseen will, it straightened and for the first time, moved of its own purpose. Leaves rustled though no wind stirred. The ground seemed to shiver beneath its steps. Where the girl's frail body had been bound by blood and bone, her shadow walked free, unhindered by pain or weakness. It moved with eerie grace, its edges blurring at times into smoke, then sharpening into clear lines under the silver moonlight. A presence radiated from it, heavy and unnatural, pressing against the trees, against the silence of the night. The animals of the forest, who had crept close to the scent of blood, now slunk away, their instincts warning them that something beyond their understanding walked among them. The shadow paused beside the girl's still form. For a long moment, it lingered as though gazing down at her face, gentle, pale in the moonlight, eyes closed forever. No tear fell from the shadow, for it carried no flesh, but the sorrow was palpable, heavy in the air like mist before dawn. It bent slightly, lowering toward her, almost touching her hand, almost as though trying to comfort the body it no longer needed. But then it rose again, straighter this time, its shape firming with each breath of the night, as though grief itself had given it weight. From far away, the faint sounds of the village drifted. Laughter, the crackle of fire, the voices of those who believed her gone forever. The shadow turned, its faceless gaze fixed in that direction. Something inside it shifted. No longer faint, no longer hesitant, its movements grew sharper, steadier. Each step it took pressed into the earth like a mark of claim, and where it passed, the ground seemed to darken. The air grew colder, heavier, wrapping the forest in a shroud of dread. The shadow's form grew clearer now. Its arms swayed with human rhythm, its stride lengthened with determination. It no longer clung to her body, it had severed that bond, carrying her pain, her sorrow, and her vow as its only essence. In silence, it walked forward as though the girl's last thoughts had poured into it. Her cries for justice, her anguish at betrayal, her defiance at being erased. The trees seemed to bow aside, opening a path for it. The moon followed above, casting a pale light upon the trail, as if guiding this strange rebirth. From the corners of the forest, whispers rose, echoes of spirits who had known betrayal, who had suffered cruel ends. They stirred with recognition, their murmurs blending with the rustle of leaves. The shadow walked among them, not part of them, but something new, born of pain yet burning with purpose. It no longer stumbled, no longer wavered. With each step, its darkness grew denser, thicker, until it seemed to carry the weight of the night within it. Where once it was faint and fragile, now it radiated a force that made the forest tremble. The girl had been left for dead, her body broken and forgotten. But her shadow refused to rest, refused to be buried in silence. It had taken her suffering and transformed it into movement, into will, into vengeance that no grave could contain. As it moved toward the village, it left behind no sound of footsteps, no rustle of leaves, only a chilling silence that seemed to follow in its wake. The girl's body remained beneath the tree, still and quiet, but her shadow had risen, carrying everything she could not finish. What had been faint now walked with certainty. What had been bound to flesh now belonged to something greater. The night knew it. The earth knew it. And soon, the villagers who had thought her gone would know it too. The night in the village was lively with drunken laughter and the crackle of fires. Men told stories of their deeds, women whispered in satisfaction that their rival was gone, and children played without knowing the cruelty that had unfolded hours before. But the night itself was changing, though they did not yet understand it. The air grew heavier, the fires flickered unnaturally, and the moon above seemed brighter, watching with a cold, unblinking eye. Somewhere in the distance, the shadow moved. It had detached itself from the girl's lifeless body, and now, with every step toward the village, the world seemed to recognize that something was deeply wrong. The animals were the first to know. Dogs that normally roamed near the fires began to whine, their ears pressed back as though they sensed a predator unseen. Goats tugged desperately at their ropes, stamping their hooves in nervous rhythm, while chickens fluttered and screeched, clashing against one another in their cages. The hunters' hounds, trained to face leopards, slunk back into corners, tails tucked between their legs. None of them barked to warn the villagers. Instead, they trembled, sensing a presence that was not of this earth. The children felt it next. Some were chasing one another near the open spaces, giggling under the watch of tired elders, when suddenly their laughter cracked and fell into cries. They clung to their mothers' skirts, pointing toward the edges of the village where the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Some swore they saw a figure moving there, tall and dark but without a face. Their mothers scolded them, thinking it was fear of the dark, but their voices carried unease, and even their eyes darted to the treeline more than once. The shadow crept closer, slipping between huts, flowing over the earth like smoke that had taken form. It left no footprints, no sound, no breath. And yet, those with guilty hearts began to feel its presence as if it were a hand pressing against their chests. Men who had thrown stones at the girl earlier now found themselves choking on their drink. Women who had mocked her stumbled as though their knees had lost strength. Their laughter wavered, then faltered, replaced by an unspoken dread that clung to the air. By the time the first of them looked to the forest's edge, the figure had already entered the village. It did not burst in with fury or noise, it simply walked, calm, deliberate, unstoppable. Its form was human yet not human, tall and thin, its body shifting as though made of smoke and night. Where the moonlight touched it, the darkness sharpened, making it unmistakable. It was her shape, the same slope of shoulders, the same tilt of head, but stripped of flesh, stripped of voice, reduced only to will. Whispers began. At first quiet, nervous mutterings, then louder, frantic questions. Some swore it was just a shadow cast by the fire. Others hissed that it was her ghost returned. The guilty, those who had tied her hands, dragged her body, or whispered for her end, knew instantly what it was. Their stomachs tightened, their throats dried, and every beat of their hearts seemed too loud, too heavy, as if the shadow might hear. It moved between them with slow steps, and the air seemed to shrink in its presence. The fires dimmed, their glow paling against the black figure. A woman tried to scream but found her voice caught, her throat locked as though invisible hands clutched it. A man dropped his gourd of beer, his trembling fingers unable to hold it. None dared move to touch it, for though it walked like flesh, there was something about it that promised doom to any hand that reached out. The children cried louder now, tugging at their parents, begging to be taken inside. Mothers clutched them tightly, but their own arms shook as though made weak by the unseen force pressing upon the village. The elders, who had always spoken of omens and spirits, lowered their eyes, refusing to meet the thing that had come among them. They too knew what it was. It was the unfinished story, the unburied truth, the return of injustice clothed in silence and shadow. And yet it said nothing. No cry, no scream, no whisper came from the dark shape. It simply looked, or gave the sense of looking, at those who had betrayed her. That faceless gaze was worse than any shout. It pierced deeper than words could reach, making the guilty sweat though the night air had grown cold. It slipped past their skin into their bones, reminding them of what they had done, of the blood they had left to fade into the dirt outside the village. As the shadow circled the fires, moving closer to the guilty hearts, fear spread like wildfire. Conversations broke, laughter died, and silence wrapped the village in a suffocating grip. Even those who had done no harm felt uneasy, for though they were innocent, they knew they stood in the presence of something greater than flesh and spirit alike. The guilty, however, felt their punishment tightening like a noose, for the shadow had not returned to wander aimlessly. It had returned with purpose, with her last unspoken vow burning in its silent steps. The shadow was back, and though the girl's body lay cold and unmoving in the wilderness, her presence walked among them, silent but unstoppable. The animals cowered, the children wept, and the guilty trembled in their skins. Justice had returned to the village, not in the form of flesh, but in the cold, dark truth of what they could not escape. The fires in the village burned low, but no one dared to add more wood. Fear kept them frozen, their eyes darting to the shifting figure that glided among them. The shadow carried no weapons, spoke no curses, yet the weight of its presence was unbearable. The guilty knew their time had come, even before the first punishment fell. It began with whispers. At first they seemed faint, like the wind rustling dry leaves. But then the guilty began to hear them more clearly, voices hissing their crimes back at them, naming each act they had thought would be buried in silence. One man who had tied the girl's wrists with rope, staggered back, clutching his head. He swore he heard her voice, soft yet steady, whispering his betrayal into his ears over and over, until he collapsed, trembling and choking, unable to drown it out. A woman who had urged the others to cast the girl away, found herself unable to breathe. She gasped, clawing at her throat, her eyes bulging as though invisible hands had wrapped around her neck. Her family tried to hold her, to fan her, to pour water down her throat, but nothing could help her. The shadow did not touch her, did not move, but her chest heaved until she slumped into silence, her face locked in terror. Another man, one of the loudest voices in condemning the girl, stood rigid near the fire. He told himself it was nothing but superstition, that the shape moving among them was only their own fear given form. But when the shadow turned its faceless gaze upon him, his knees buckled. His heart hammered, too fast, too hard, until he collapsed before everyone, clutching his chest as if it were being crushed from the inside. The villagers backed away, their screams piercing the night, but no one dared rush to help him. Within moments he lay still. The punishments spread one by one, deliberate, precise. It was not chaos, it was justice moving with cold patience. Those who had dragged her body, those who had spit on her name, those who had mocked her cries as she faded, each of them felt the weight of their cruelty reflected back upon them. None escaped the judgment. Some fell into violent fits, their mouths foaming as though their own guilt poisoned their blood. Others collapsed silently, their faces pale as the life drained from them. The villagers who had no hand in her betrayal could only watch, trembling, terrified. They pressed themselves against the walls of their huts, clutching their children close, praying that the faceless spirit would pass them by. They had not lifted a hand against her, but even so, being near such wrath made their hearts quake. The innocent were forced to witness what justice looked like when carried not by men, but by something greater, something unstoppable. Every punishment was a mirror of the cruelty that had been inflicted upon the girl. Those who had bound her felt their own bodies stiffen until they could no longer move. Those who had silenced her felt their own voices stolen, their screams dying in their throats. Those who had laughed as she suffered now gasped their last breaths in front of the very people who had joined their mockery. Each fall was a reminder that no act of cruelty goes unanswered forever. The shadow never rushed, never stumbled. It glided with the same steady rhythm, its steps deliberate, its faceless form tilting just enough to let each guilty soul know they had been seen, that their crimes had been marked. No one could escape by running. Those who tried found their legs faltering, their vision spinning, until they collapsed mid-stride. No one could fight it. Their spears, lifted in trembling hands, grew too heavy to hold, falling uselessly to the ground. When the last of the guilty collapsed, silence blanketed the village. The air was thick with smoke, with fear, with the stench of sweat and bloodless death. The fires hissed as though they too were afraid to burn too brightly. Children whimpered into their mothers' skirts. The innocent dared not look too long at the shadow, for its faceless form seemed to stretch higher and darker the longer it stood among them. It lingered, still and quiet as if waiting. Some thought it would strike them next, that no one would be spared. But the shadow moved past them, sliding into the heart of the village where the dead and dying lay. It stood over them for a long moment, and the whispers that had tormented the guilty now filled the silence once more, but this time only the punished could hear them. Their bodies twitched, their eyes rolled, and then all was still. The shadow had finished the first part of its task. The girl's suffering had not been forgotten. Her cries had not been wasted in the darkness where they left her. The unfinished thread of her story had been pulled tight, woven into a pattern of vengeance that none could deny. She had returned, not with her voice, not with her hands, but with the silent power of her shadow. When it finally turned away, moving toward the edge of the village once more, the survivors exhaled as though they had been holding their breath for hours. But relief did not come. For though they were alive, they knew this was only the beginning. The shadow had punished the guilty, but justice was not yet complete. Something still lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. And as the faceless shape slipped back into the night, every villager knew, this was not over. The village, once a place of daily rhythms, children laughing, women pounding grain, men returning from the fields, was now overtaken by an unshakable unease. It began as whispers among the elders, muttered between cracks of fear, but soon it filled every household like smoke that could not be driven out. Something moved among them, something they could not name without trembling. Doors creaked in the dead of night when no one touched them. Fires dimmed as though an unseen hand smothered their light. Even the bravest hunters, men who had once faced wild beasts without flinching, now woke sweating at the rustle of leaves, certain that something was watching them from the darkness. The shadow's presence was never fully seen, yet always felt. Animals grew restless, stamping and refusing food. Dogs whimpered and barked at nothing, circling huts as though warding off an unseen predator. Mothers clutched their infants to their breasts when the wind moaned, convinced it carried her voice. And when children cried in the night, their parents silenced them quickly, too afraid the sound might attract what lingered beyond the firelight. The village that had once mocked her suffering now spoke her name only in whispers, if at all, for every mention seemed to stir the air with dread. Those who had mocked her most loudly were the first to break. One man, who had laughed as she bled upon the thorns, woke to find his hut filled with a suffocating darkness that clung to his chest. He gasped, clawed at his throat, and screamed until neighbors found him shaking on the ground, his voice gone forever. Another, who had cast stones at her when she stumbled, began to hear her footsteps behind him at all hours. Whether he walked the fields, bathed at the river, or sat in the safety of the fire circle, the sound followed him. He shouted at empty air, cursed shadows on the walls, until his mind unraveled, and he could no longer tell dream from waking. The others saw his madness and knew it was no sickness of the body, it was her. Soon no one felt safe. The women refused to fetch water after dusk. Men avoided the fields at dawn, fearing the mist that curled low across the grass might conceal her. Even the elders, whose authority had once been unquestioned, spoke less boldly, their chants and protective charms failing to lift the weight pressing down on the village. They burned herbs, tied talismans above doorways, and sang prayers deep into the night, but the air remained thick with her silent presence. It was as if the very ground carried her memory, bleeding it into their steps. Children, too young to understand guilt, bore the terror most openly. They clung to their mother's legs, crying when the sun slipped behind the hills. They claimed to see her form at the edge of the huts, standing still and watching. Some whispered of her sitting by the well, her face hidden, her shadow longer than it should be. Parents hushed them, but they could not deny the way their own hair rose at the nape of their necks when the children spoke. Even those who had no hand in her torment felt hunted, for the shadow did not care for innocence or guilt, it sought acknowledgement, a reckoning, and until it was satisfied, no one could find peace. Fear reshaped their lives. The market grew empty as people stayed inside, food left to spoil rather than risk crossing her path. The sound of drumming and laughter that once filled the nights was gone, replaced by silence so deep it pressed into their ears. Couples stopped gathering to share stories, for they were certain she listened. Loneliness grew heavier than hunger. When night fell, each family sat in the dark, clutching one another, dreading the brush of air that might signal her arrival. The guilty whispered among themselves, trying to devise ways to protect their lives. Some spoke of fleeing the village, but fear bound them tighter than walls. Where could they run that her essence would not follow? Others begged the elders for rituals of cleansing, but every attempt only deepened the despair, for the drums cracked, the fire sputtered, and every chant seemed drowned out by the echo of her silent scream. The more they feared, the stronger her presence became. What had begun as faint stirrings grew into a storm of dread, pressing on every chest, twisting every dream. Sleep was no longer a refuge. In their dreams they saw her eyes, open and unblinking, staring from the darkness. In their dreams, they felt her pain and woke screaming, only to find the nightmare had not ended. The village was no longer a place of the living. It became a theater of haunting, where each person carried guilt like a second skin and dread like a shadow that never let go. They had thought her suffering would end with her last breath, but now they realized the truth: death had not silenced her. It had given her the freedom to rise beyond flesh, to carry justice into a realm they could not escape. And so, terror spread not just through their days but into the very marrow of their bones. They lived not with the memory of what they had done, but with the certainty that she had returned, not as the girl they had tormented, but as something greater, something that would not rest until every soul who had stood against her trembled in the same agony she once endured. The village, once alive with song and laughter, had become her domain, and every heart that beat within it now did so with the knowledge that justice had come, not from the living but from the shadow of the girl they thought they had buried. The nights grew longer, or so it felt, as the shadow gathered itself into something more than whispers, more than flickers of dread. It had been faint when it first returned, a haze of vengeance clinging to walls and breathing through the cracks of huts. But now it had weight. It no longer lingered at the edges. It entered boldly, filling rooms with its presence, settling like a storm cloud that refused to pass. The guilty, who once thought themselves safe behind charms and prayers, began to understand the futility of their efforts. They had sown cruelty and the harvest had come due. It began quietly, almost mercifully. The shadow passed through the homes of the innocent, those who had looked away, those too weak or powerless to stop her torment, and though they trembled, they were spared. In their huts, the fires dimmed but never died, and though they felt the chill of her passing, it left them unharmed. Mothers clutched their children and whispered thanks into the darkness, knowing that mercy was the only gift she would offer. But the homes of the cruel became chambers of reckoning. One by one the guilty felt her approach and none could hide. The man who had ordered her beaten found himself gasping as the air thickened inside his hut. The shadow pressed down on him, suffocating not his body but his soul. He clawed at the ground, begging forgiveness, but his voice was swallowed before it reached the door. He collapsed, his final sight the shape of her silhouette rising from the corner like smoke given form. Another, a woman who had mocked her cries and joined the chorus of tormentors, heard whispers in the silence. Her own words twisted back against her. The same insults she had spat came now from the walls, from the floor, from her own lips though she tried not to speak. She covered her ears, but the voices crawled through her skull until she broke, screaming at the darkness that closed in and dragged her into stillness. The shadow did not hurry. It moved with purpose, calm and unrelenting, as though time itself bowed to its will. Each hut it entered was marked by a silence deeper than death, a silence that spread through the village like a stain. Neighbors dared not investigate when cries rang out. They sat frozen, listening as the guilty choked, as prayers turned to wails and wails to nothingness. Fear pinned them to the ground, knowing it was not their choice who would be spared. By now there was no denying what haunted them. The elders who had once claimed wisdom sat speechless, powerless in the face of a justice that required no ritual. They had thought her death the end of her story, but the shadow proved that her suffering had only been a beginning. It was not vengeance alone, it was balance, a force older than their chance and stronger than their charms. It spared those who had not touched her pain, and it destroyed those whose hands had been heavy with cruelty. The animals sensed it too. Dogs no longer barked, they whined low and curled into corners. Goats refused to graze near the huts of the condemned. Even the birds abandoned the trees above the village, leaving a stillness that made the air heavy and unnatural. The earth itself seemed to know that judgment walked across it, silent but absolute. Some tried to run. Under cover of night, 2 men who had tormented her most viciously took to the forest paths, hoping distance might shield them. But the shadow followed, swift as breath, and before dawn their bodies were found twisted at the foot of the great tree. There were no wounds, no blood, only faces frozen in terror, eyes wide as if they had seen what no living man should see. The message was clear: there was no escape. Those who survived, the ones who had not joined the cruelty, began to speak softly of her, not with fear but with reverence. They left food at the crossroads, water at the well, offerings not to appease her wrath but to honor her endurance. They began to understand that the shadow was not a curse upon them, but a reckoning upon those who had betrayed what it meant to be human. By the 3rd night the village was a husk of itself. Fires no longer burned in certain huts, their occupants gone into silence. Laughter had vanished, replaced by the hollow weight of survival. Yet even in their fear, some felt the first stirrings of relief. The cruelty that had stained their lives had been confronted, swept away not by human hands but by a force they could not resist. And so the shadow reached its fullness, neither raging nor relenting, but steady as the tide. It moved through homes until its work was complete, until the guilty were gone and only the innocent remained. Then for the first time the village felt a strange quiet, a quiet not born of dread but of release. They knew the shadow would linger in memory, but its fury was spent. Justice had walked among them, and none who deserved it had escaped its reach. In the end the people stood together beneath the clear night sky, shaken but alive. They knew they would carry her story for generations, not as a tale of fear alone, but as a warning. Cruelty could silence a body, but it could not silence a spirit. Injustice could bury a girl, but it could not bury her truth. Her shadow had risen, and in rising, it had torn away the veil of impunity that cloaked their cruelty. The final reckoning was not just her victory, it was the rebirth of the village itself, cleansed by the shadow of the one they had tried to destroy. And from that night forward, none forgot the lesson carved into their souls. Justice will always find its way, even if it must rise from the grave to claim it. The first light of dawn crept across the horizon, spilling over the village like a hesitant blessing. After nights filled with dread, silence now reigned, though it was not the comfortable silence of peace, but the hollow quiet that followed devastation. The survivors, pale with fear and sleeplessness, gathered slowly near the edge of the forest. A rumor had spread, whispered from trembling lips to trembling ears: her body had been found. They walked in hesitant clusters, afraid of what awaited them. Some carried small bundles of herbs or charms, clinging to the thought that protection still mattered, though deep down they knew such things had been powerless against the shadow. The air was cold, unnaturally so, as if the earth itself still held the echo of her passing. Even the birds dared not sing in the trees. And then there she was. Her body lay beneath the great tree where the villagers had first abandoned her. The ground around her was soft with dew, and though her form was still, there was no violence upon her flesh. No claw marks, no twisted expression of suffering. Her eyes were closed as though in sleep, her lips calm, her hands resting gently across her chest. Death had touched her, yes, but it had not claimed her in torment. Instead, her face carried a serenity that unsettled those who looked upon it. Children, too young to understand but old enough to feel, wept quietly as their mothers pulled them close. The men who had once laughed at her weakness shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet her stillness with the same arrogance they once held. To see her lying there, so calm, so untouchable in her silence, made them feel smaller than they ever had. Some swore the shadow lingered still, hovering above her body like a faint shimmer in the air. They whispered that it had returned to her, that after its terrible work, it had folded itself back into the shell it once belonged to. A few dared to step closer, their feet pressing nervously into the damp soil. They bent to touch her, to confirm the truth, and when they felt the cold of her skin, they withdrew in shock. Yet what frightened them more was not her death, but the strange peace it carried. For 3 nights, her shadow had been vengeance incarnate. It had punished, it had balanced, it had reminded the world that cruelty could not bury innocence. And now, with the guilty gone and justice fulfilled, the shadow seemed to have no more purpose. It lay still, resting within her body as though it had finally returned home. The elders, voices once loud with commands and judgments, found themselves silent. They had no words to explain what had happened, no wisdom that could lessen the weight of her story. One of them, trembling with age, finally spoke. The earth saw her pain. The sky saw her truth. We mocked her, and now we stand judged. His words carried no authority, only the brittle honesty of a man broken by what he had witnessed. The villagers began to murmur prayers, not the empty chants they had used before, but raw whispers begging for forgiveness. Some laid offerings at her side, flowers, beads, fruits, and though these could not undo their cruelty, they offered them with shaking hands, hoping the gesture might soften the legacy of their guilt. Mothers pressed their children forward, urging them to remember her, to never forget that a gentle girl, mocked and betrayed, had risen in ways none could understand. Her grave was dug near the roots of the great tree, the very place where her life had been abandoned. The digging was slow, not from lack of strength but from the heaviness of hearts. With every shovelful of soil, they remembered their role in her suffering, whether by action or silence. When at last the ground was ready, they lowered her body with reverence as though laying down a queen. As the final soil covered her form, a wind stirred through the branches above, carrying a sound like a sigh. Some said it was the last breath of her shadow, released into the morning, finally at rest. Others claimed it was the earth itself promising to guard her forever. Whatever it was, it silenced the crowd, pressing them into stillness as the grave was sealed. The villagers left slowly, their steps heavy, their eyes refusing to meet one another. None could erase what had been done, nor could they forget the nights of terror when her shadow walked among them. But as dawn broke fully across the land, one truth settled deep into their bones. She had not been defeated. Even in death she had risen higher than any of them. Her peace was untouchable, her memory immortal, and her story carved into the soil itself. And so the grave remained, silent yet alive in its warning. Those who passed it lowered their eyes, some in sorrow, others in shame. For they knew that though her body slept beneath the earth, her shadow had never truly gone. It had simply returned to rest, watching, waiting, forever tied to the girl who had been wronged and who had, in the end, written her own legend in darkness and light. They say time softens all wounds, but the village that betrayed the girl would never again walk lightly in the dark. Her grave remained beneath the great tree, its roots spreading like veins, clutching the earth as though holding her story within. At first, the villagers tried to go about their lives, rebuilding homes, replanting fields, hosting festivals as if to banish the weight of what had been. Yet the silence never truly left them. Nights felt heavier. Shadows seemed longer. And every whisper of wind through the forest carried with it the memory of her name. Children grew up hearing the tale from trembling elders who had lived through it. They were warned never to wander too far from home after dusk, for shadows might not follow them back. They were told never to mock the weak or betray the innocent, for the earth itself remembered such cruelty. Around the fires at night, the old ones would speak of her gentle heart, her betrayal, and the terrible justice that followed. They told it not as a story of vengeance but as a lesson, one carved into their very blood. The younger ones often asked, was it truly her shadow? Could a shadow walk alone? The elders would only shake their heads, their eyes dark with memory. It was not a shadow like the ones cast by firelight. It was the weight of her pain, the echo of her soul, the truth that we tried to bury but could not. Shadows remember what the living forget. Over the years, her legend spread beyond the borders of the village. Travelers carried it across rivers and mountains, weaving it into songs, warnings, and whispered tales told in marketplaces and along dusty roads. Each version shifted slightly, but the heart remained the same. A girl wronged, abandoned, and silenced, whose shadow rose to deliver the justice her frail body could not. Some said her shadow still lingered in the forest, watching those who dared walk there after midnight. Others claimed the moon itself had claimed her spirit, so that on the brightest nights her silhouette could be seen dancing among the branches, reminding the world that no cruelty was ever forgotten. Farmers, fearful of tempting fate, would leave offerings near her grave, bowls of grain, clay beads, or cups of water. Not for her body, which lay in peace, but for her shadow, which they prayed never to awaken again. Generations passed, yet the story refused to fade. In times of hardship, the villagers would invoke her name, urging one another to act with kindness lest her shadow return. Children, when cruel to one another, were hushed with the warning, "Be careful. Shadows do not forgive." The story became not only a legend but a guide, shaping how people lived, how they treated the weak, how they remembered the unseen weight of their actions. Travelers who heard the tale often looked back nervously at their own shadows, wondering if wrongs they had committed might one day rise up against them. The legend became bigger than the girl herself. She was no longer just a betrayed child. She was a symbol of justice beyond the grave, of cruelty that never truly vanished, but echoed back when least expected. And so, when night fell and the moon climbed high, people walked with caution. They kept their voices low, their laughter tempered, their hearts aware of what had been. For the villagers, and the countless others who carried the story after them, knew the truth at last: shadows are not empty. They are the keepers of memory, the carriers of what we try to bury. The girl's name faded in time, lost to the centuries, but her story never did. She was remembered as a presence, a warning, a dark legend told in silence. And whenever cruelty rose in a heart, whenever envy or fear pushed someone toward betrayal, all it took was one whispered reminder to stop them cold. Remember the girl who was left for dead. Remember how her shadow returned. For in every shadow they now saw more than darkness. They saw memory. They saw justice. They saw her.